Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Gregory Warrow. I'm a professor of political science and director of the political analytics program here at Columbia. So we've gathered here to talk about the election that just happened, and we have an amazing panel of people who can share tremendous insights about the election. I know election has many people scratching their heads. In the analytics community, we like to think that everything has an explanation, and we can sort through the data and figure out why things turned out the way they did. So hopefully we'll be able to provide you with some information that you did not have prior to attending this evening's event. So I want to introduce our panel. I'm extremely grateful for everyone who has agreed to be here tonight. Also a shout out to our political analytics students who are here tonight. And if anybody's interested in the program, please reach out to me or some of the others who are here from the program, and we can provide you with more information. Okay, so let's introduce our panel. So immediately to my right here is Dr. Basil Smikle Jr. He's a professor of practice and director of the MS program in nonprofit management in the School of Professional Studies here at Columbia. Basil previously served as the executive director of the New York State Democratic Party and has worked as a senior aide to Hillary Rodham Clinton on her Senate staff. Next to Basil, it's my pleasure to welcome back to campus Dr. Alyssa Stolwerk. Alyssa is vice president of YouGov Blue, YouGov's research division that works with Democratic and left of center clients in the US and around the globe. She has over 20 years of experience in Democratic politics and political analytics, is a trusted advisor to campaigns, advocacy organizations, and nonprofits. Alyssa got her PhD, said in 2017, it was finally awarded. So, this is her first time back to campus. So thanks for coming back. It's great to see you. Next to Alyssa is Susan Del Percio. She's a nationally recognized crisis communication expert, public affairs strategist, and speaker. She is a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC, a columnist for Know Your Value, a contributor to NBC News Think, and was a credited consultant for the award-winning HBO show The Newsroom. Thank you, Susan, for being here. You're now part of the Columbia family, so we'll have you teaching a class before you know it. And then last, but of course not least, is Jeffrey Pollack. Jeff is the founding partner and president of Global Strategy Group. He's been twice awarded the Pollster of the Year by his peers in the bipartisan American Association of Political Consultants. His political clients include governors like Kathy Hochul, Josh Shapiro, Senators Kirsten Gillibrand and Joe Manchin, and many more in all levels of government. Jeff has also taught at Columbia, and so we're sort of welcoming you back to campus for this event as well. So thank you. I can't express my appreciation enough for you being here and for sharing your knowledge, experience, and insights with those who have gathered here. Okay, so I'm going to start off with Alyssa. I'm going to put you on the spot, just like we used to do in class when you were doing your PhD here. So I was wondering, I know this may not exactly be in your job description at YouGov, but being around, so those of you who don't know, YouGov is one of the premier pollsters. They have been innovators in a lot of respects for polling, especially at lower levels than the national level. And so, of course, presidential elections, congressional elections, they're all local elections, right? We don't have a national election really in this country. And so it's very important to have the kind of information that YouGov gathers in terms of what's happening at the lower levels. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how things looked in the run-up to the election from the perspective of somebody who's working at a place like YouGov. And so if you look at a lot of the polls, especially in the swing states, they were in the margin of error. But I was wondering whether you and the people you work with were seeing anything that suggested that Trump would sweep those states like he did. And is there anything that we might learn from what trends we were seeing in the run-up to the election that would help us understand how things are going to play out in the future?
Of course. So YouGov was doing two different types of polling throughout the election. We first were doing polling in the traditional sense that, truly is like the polling you would see from most of the survey houses, where we were surveying in states and weighting those in a traditional manner. But then we also were doing a model called multi-level regression with post-stratification, or MRP, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to get a lot of data nationally and then be able to use that to model and disaggregate to the local level and get a better estimate that you could doing a survey in any one congressional district, also in a more cost-effective manner. And, both of the polling was showing that this was going to be a very tight race. I think for the most part, both our polling and the media polling was showing that it was going to be a tight race and it could go either way. I think the pollsters in general got that right, but maybe didn't show that it was going to be a red America the next morning. But I think what's important to know is that most of these polls, as Greg said, were in the margin of error. And the other thing that we consistently saw is that the states were moving together, right? There might be one state that was +2 Kamala and one state that was +2 Trump, but the states in general moved together. After Biden's debate performance, Biden was losing across states. With the excitement over Kamala and the replacement and all of the attention that brought, she was moving up. In October, again, across the states, most of what we saw was that the states were all trending downward. So people were like, okay, we have 7 battlegrounds, they're each a coin toss. But I think it's helpful to think that in the end of the day, it was probably 1 coin toss and not 7 coin tosses. So we saw that kind of uniform swing. And so given that, even if we weren't entirely sure which way the night was going to go, it's not surprising that all 7 went in one direction.
So they all went in Trump's direction. And so, Susan, I wanted to turn to you because a few months ago, you wrote about from a strategist standpoint that the people who are working for Trump were having a hard time keeping him on message, staying away from talking about the same old grievances and sort of making the case for why we should be focused on the issues that matter to voters generally. So at the end of the day, he won. So from your perspective, when things swung toward Trump, was it because they were his strategists were able to get him to do enough of the focus on issues away from the grievances, or is Trump basically have some sort of resilience that we've never seen in a presidential candidate before, or is it just like there were other forces that were at play that just kind of overwhelmed everything?
There were so many factors that went into the Trump win, but also if you look at the numbers, Trump actually improved his total. He was able to, what I call mine for new voters, which I honestly thought he would be tapped out on. Whereas Harris was right now significantly below the number of voters that Joe Biden had, which kind of tells you it was a base issue. But I think the thing that most people like me, pundits and what have you, and people who write silly columns like that, what they missed was people like me. I was asking, I couldn't believe that people would be like, how could you vote for him? You know what he is. You know what he said about you, right? How could you vote for him? But the question that we should have been asking is, why are you willing to overlook it? We assume that, there was a lot of misinformation out there, but you know what? Voters are smart. People made decisions based on what they thought was in their best interest. It was not a lot of people I know in my business like to blame a lot on disinformation. I think we just didn't ask the right questions. What got you past Donald Trump? And, just polling for a candidate is a lot different. Like, for example, I do work with Emerson College. So I'm trying to figure out what the horse race numbers are. Jeff is finding a way to get his client elected and who's gettable and how to get them. So again, I think there's this narrative out there that comes across from public polling that is not very helpful to the conversation, because really the only thing public pollings do is create a narrative for the winning side and help with fundraising. That's the only purpose they have. They are not predictors whatsoever when it comes to the elections. But I think the polling also, there was one other thing that I do think had Democrats looking a little bit more sunny than they would have come Sunday. And that was the Ann Stelzer poll for Iowa. Mm-hmm. I think that was it was for me. I thought, forget if Harris is up 3. I was like, if she's down 4, wow, that is something. And I said, and Harris has the ground game and all of these things. And, there's one saying I have, and it's really important for all of you looking at campaigns, is you never know what's going in. A campaign's like a marriage. You never know what's going on unless you're in it. So we can all look and make comparisons or say what went wrong or what the decision they made was wrong, but we don't know why they did it. Now, maybe Jeff will tell us. But but at the end of the day, again, Trump is a phenomenon. I don't think anyone else can be Trump but Trump. We've seen him lose when he was in office. He lost the midterms. He can only get away with it. But that coalition, the people who said, I had enough of the establishment, they're not going away. Mm-hmm. And it's just who finds a way to lead them. And I don't think it has to be anyone close to Donald Trump. It's just someone who could tap into that.
Let me follow up on that with Jeff. So you've sort of been prompted by Susan to explain some of the stuff that's going on here. So in 2020, we saw a small but discernible increase in Latino support for Trump. So this idea of like there were some gettable voters out there. And so in 2024, I think we might characterize it as a Latino wave in Trump's direction. Sure. And so in terms of these gettable voters, like was this a group of gettable voters in your view? And if so, what explains why we saw such a strong movement in that direction? And could it be a more permanent shift?
So I tend to think we always overthink the results of an election, particularly when we talk about things like permanence. And Donald Trump is so unusual in his ability to attract folks. In addition, what we know about this election is that the economy dominated first, second, and third in the voters' minds. And that's from young voters to older voters to Hispanic to white to black, did not matter. The economy was the dominant thing that people were thinking of, and the economy, inflation, those two factors together. So what Hispanic voters did in many ways across this country is vote with their wallets. But there's also, it is also clear when you think about what happened in a place like South Texas on the border, that sure, that the economy is a part of it, but also their clear hostility about immigration, which to many of us in blue states and sitting in a place like New York seems like, well, how can that be possible? But I would sit, and I said this to Basil before, I would sit in focus group with Hispanic voters. They would talk about immigration, and you would swear to God you were sitting in a room with a bunch of cranky white guys from Missouri, not Hispanic voters, when you were talking about immigration. And so the flaw there is that the sort of mass increase in immigration, which happened in the first couple of years of the Biden administration, that will have been one of the great reasons potentially that we lost. When Biden did the executive order 6 months ago, 8 months ago, whatever it was, and stemmed the flow of immigration to a level that was actually even lower than under Trump, all of a sudden it was a different environment. But the politics of doing that are pretty tough for a Democratic president in Washington. So I think the economy and immigration were both relevant. Do I think that this means that there's a permanent realignment with Hispanics? No, I don't. And I think we will see whether or not Trump and the right are able to even sustain some of what they got this time in the midterms in 2 years.
Great, thank you. So we have the economy dominating, as it often does in elections. Immigration was also an issue. Basil, I want to turn to you to talk about the issue of reproductive rights. Right. So post-Dobbs, reproductive rights seem to have supercharged mobilization among Democrats and pro-choice independents. We see basically in every election up until this one, whether abortion was reproductive rights were specifically on the ballot or not, that everything was breaking in the Democrats' way in reaction to Dobbs, it seems. So it seems like though that it mattered less in 2024, right? And so is it the case that concerns about reproductive rights had less of an impact in this election? And if so, why?
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for doing this, because the one thing that has popped up over the last week and change since the election are a lot of hot takes. And I love the ability to have a thoughtful conversation with folks here. So thank you, especially Jeff, who we were classmates at SEPA together in the 90s, and Susan, who I've known for 20 years, and we've been on TV together for a long time. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, we've been talking about this together for a very long time. So the short answer is, to me, from my vantage point, the Democrats did put a lot of emphasis on reproductive rights, thinking that they would be able to get both women of color, but also white women to go in their direction. But I want to sort of talk a little bit about and refer to something that both Jeff and Susan have said. Because one of the things that has always stuck with me, and this was going back to when Hillary was running for the Senate, and I worked on that first Senate race and worked in her Senate office. But she could not get the support of a lot of cops and firefighters. Just could not. A lot of uniformed workers, mostly white men, right? And very vexing. And we also recognize she didn't get a lot of support from suburban white women for a number of reasons, which we can get into if you'd like. But one thing that always stuck with me, and I'm paraphrasing, but not much, and I've actually never talked about this openly. So first, I'm debuting this information. Heard it here first. And I work for her. She's a mentor of mine, love her to death. But this was a difficult issue for us to overcome. One of the firefighters said, when sort of asked about why they didn't really like Hillary or weren't really, and we were helping them post 9/11, mind you. They said, she is who we would want our daughters to be, but not our wives. Now think about that. I mean, just really think about that, and the dynamic of that household, right? So if you're mindful of that, and then you start to say, well, yeah, we can hit on reproductive rights, that should be the issue, and then you're like, perhaps not. If you think about the dynamic in that household with those voters, with that mindset from the male in that household, you may think differently about what issues then start to bubble to the forefront, right? And how that household might vote. And so, yes, there is a sense that the Democrats were going to, well, not a sense, but the Democrats did hang their hope on reproductive rights, saying, after 2016, and there was this rally in DC, and all these women came together, that yes, the white women in particular would gravitate towards this issue and vote for Dems on this issue, but recognizing that there are a lot of other factors that are pulling voters in many different ways, that clearly it wasn't the issue. Let me just add this one point, because I have to say this point. I wrestle with whether or not this was the economy was at issue here. And I know what folks have said. I know what people have said. But somewhere on the permission structure that Trump created to get folks to vote for him, wondering how they overcome the who he is to go vote for him, he spent more time talking about what Haitians eat than the price of eggs. So you have to then convince me that this is an economic issue. Because somewhere in that permission structure is a conversation about the Latino vote and who has been here for a while versus who just came here and where they are in that hierarchy. There's a question about, well, do we really want a woman to run this country? There's a question about, who's really Black? We were having that conversation, like what's really Black in this country. And when you set that dialogue out there, to me, you're not talking about the economy. What you're doing is validating people's feelings and concerns at a very base level that gets them to the point where they say, my economic situation is not where it should be because we're dealing with all these issues and people on this side. So there's another conversation, I'll stop here. There's another conversation about how Democrats should have dealt with that. But to me, I know what they've said, and I don't deny that any of the polling brings that out. That's what they said, but you can't tell me that's not how they felt. So I'll leave it there.
Alyssa, you wanted to comment on this?
I agree with a lot of what Basil said, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about that idea of a permission structure, because what we also saw is abortion actually did wonderfully on the ballot. When it was a referendum, it did wonderfully. A lot of lower races, right? We saw, for many reasons, Senate candidates running ahead of the top of the ticket. And I think in some ways the abortion ballots, in a way, backfired a bit on Democratic strategy, because it created this permission structure where you could vote for the referendum and say, okay, I'm now safe in my state, but I want to vote for Trump because he's a businessman who's going to lower the price of eggs or whatever other reason it may be. And so I think in some ways that strategy of putting referendum, it was probably based on, that 2004 DOMA strategy back in the day, may have backfired or worked differently in this Dobbs environment.
Just to piggyback on your piggyback, we did have Prop 1 in New York, which did win. Despite some some pushback by Republicans. I just thought that that's my piggyback on your piggyback.
Just on New York, it's funny that you bring that up. Someone said, "Well, how come the polls didn't see everything?" I said, maybe they weren't polling the right places.
In what?
I mean, in the sense of I think the polls got it right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But I'm saying, what maybe we should have been paying attention to places that you normally look at, like New York, to get a sense of where the mood of the country was. Those are the things that's kind of really concern me, is if you look at where Harris just kind of cut Biden's numbers in half, and why. And that's where I always want to go back to. Why? Why was it okay to do that? What was that permission structure? And I think that's just a really important issue when we start tearing apart the numbers. It is arts and science. There are the numbers. And I'm a big believer in the polling. Don't get me wrong. And especially when you're in the campaign, I think it plays such a critical role and it guides you tremendously. But there's something that we aren't able to quite capture, I think, that we need to start focusing on, and how maybe it's how people get their information and how we're reaching them. I'm not sure, but there's something there I think we need to look at.
There's one thing, Basil, that I would disagree with. So you're right that Donald Trump spent his time talking about Haitians eating pets. But and Donald Trump, the public clown, and media coverage is the one thing, but there was $1 billion spent on advertising, and those advertisements were spent talking. 50% of those advertisements were about Bidenomics and the economy. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about the swing states, it's hard for me to not actually see that the economy wasn't sort of dominant. They certainly saw it. And then the second set of advertisements that the Trump, and when I say Trump, I mean sort of the MAGA Trump boat, but also the super PACs and the rest of the folks. The other was on transgender stuff. And the transgender ad was so powerful in some ways because you had Kamala Harris on camera saying something that seemingly the average voter might not agree with. But what I actually think is that ad, I don't believe that voters voted because of being uncomfortable with transgender stuff. The ad said, as Basil said actually earlier, that the Democrats have the wrong priorities, right? That our priorities are making sure, and I heard it countless times. Okay, so she's paying for transgender surgery for a prisoner, but if you go to New York and you're an illegal immigrant, you get a free hotel room, right? Or you get a card.
Doesn't that all go back to what you said earlier? I mean, earlier you said it was the economy and inflation.
Yeah,
but
both.
Really, immigration became an economic issue.
Oh, I agree.
As did transgender. It was all about you're not getting this because someone else is.
Or they don't get us. Or they don't get us. The Democratic Party doesn't get us.
So all of those things can be true. And I don't think we disagree. Actually, I agree exactly what you're saying, because we heard you're going to lose control of this. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, because we were hearing that Republicans were sending mail into swing states that Democrats are going to take away your menthol cigarettes. So a lot of that is absolutely happening. So, but I think what I'm saying is that what Democrats are being accused of is cultural elitism. And all of what you're saying in terms of those kinds of ads that were being played is a response to this notion that Democrats are these cultural elites and are not really finding the vote, like going to the voter where they are, right? And actually talking about the things that what others would say that, Americans are dealing with in their sort of day-to-day lives, which are the price of eggs, which is our gas prices, things like that. And I think there's a conversation to be had about whether or not Democrats should have said things differently, done things differently. But I just I sort of feel as though there's always a backlash. And I think we have to really talk about that. There's always a backlash. 1954, Brown versus Board of Ed, and the federal government says you've got to integrate schools. And what happens? For decades, we saw a litigate and legislate strategy where you had white Southerners saying, no, we're going to find a way to continue to stall this, right? You had white flight, which we all know about, right? You had school districts in Virginia that literally closed schools in the district, one for 5 years, so that they didn't have to accept Black students. So there's always been this backlash. We saw this with Obama. I mean, it's the Kenyan, right? It's birtherism, right? There's a backlash. And I think to some extent, there's always this movement of the culture, if you will. There's always this movement of people who've been disadvantaged to have more rights and more opportunities. Problem is sometimes this happens and there are folks that don't know how to talk about it. They don't know how to raise it. They don't know how to take it into communities, and there's a backlash. And if you're not prepared for the backlash, you're going to get exactly what we're getting now.
But at the same time, here's what I still can't get past is the strategy. And I did Lincoln Project, Republicans and Independents for Biden in 2020. And that was the country first, and we're all familiar with that. I didn't think that strategy was a good strategy for Biden in 2024, and I didn't think it was a good strategy for Harris either. But there had to be something in the numbers in the private polling that showed she didn't have the base. Because why did she spend so much of the closing campaign with Liz Cheney and talking about that? That is something I can only say they knew they didn't have the base and they needed to get the numbers from somewhere else. Because otherwise, why do that when you know you have that problem at home?
What is the question for both Alyssa and Jeff? What is the Democratic base right now? I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I think before I answer that question, I wanted to chime in on one other thing, which I think is very important, though, with this idea of campaign effects, right? Because what, Jeff, for example, what you were saying with, well, there's Trump the clown, but then there's Trump with his economic ads and bullying trans kids. But the thing is the battleground strategy was actually much better than the national strategy, right? Yes. She only shifted around 3 points on average in the battlegrounds. It was nationally where we see huge drops in Texas, in New York, in New Jersey, right? So I think they're actually, when you want to talk about campaign effects, which I know many people often say, oh, the campaign doesn't matter, it's all partisanship. There were real campaign effects. And the ads that I think also that Kamala's team was running were doing a lot of work. The field program was doing a lot of work. And I think some of what we want to talk about with the broader vibes questions, to be honest, is what was happening nationally, that we see these very large shifts that absolutely hurt congressional candidates, that hurt state house and state senate candidates across the country.
You were anticipating a lot of my questions, and there's so many things to follow up here. So I'm happy to have this free-flowing discussion. It's wonderful. But I'd like to take a conversation back to the economy and the sort of, you brought up the point of vibes, right? And this idea of the how people were developing their perceptions and opinions of the economy, right? So we know that polling now in the economy, economic evaluations is very polarized. When there's a Republican in the White House, Republicans say economy is great. When there's a Democrat in the White House, they say it's terrible. And you have a mirror image for Democrats, right? And so one of the things that I found curious, and I'd love to hear all panelists' thoughts on, are this idea of do we need to have different models of how people are forming your economic perceptions? And so we came out of the pandemic, in my view, I'm not an economist, but as good as any nation did, right? In the sense that inflation was incredibly high, right? But we never went into a recession. Like, according to the measurables, we never did. There was not massive unemployment. Employment was up, but it was sort of like we shut down our economy, right? Like the analogy that we basically, it was a medically induced coma, right? In the sense that we had to shut everything down. And so unemployment went up, but it came down. Inflation was up, but it came down. I mean, obviously, cost of living stayed up. growth was sustained throughout all of this, right? Other countries went into recession. And so is it your sense that basically we had this cost of living increase, and that is really, how do they form their perceptions of like what cost of living is, what it should have been based on this shock that basically none of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes?
Debt. The amount of debt, especially when it comes to credit cards that people were carrying, credit card rates have gone up. The inflation hasn't slowed the rate that people are carrying that debt on.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the Hispanic community, and I've been watching this for a few years through a study that's been done, is home ownership. It's unattainable. The American dream is not there. Your kids cannot buy a home. They're going to live with you until they're 45, and then maybe they can afford an apartment. And I'm exaggerating, yes, but when it comes to that, it was the interest rates on mortgages and credit cards that I think people felt the most in their pockets, because the other things you can explain away, but that you can't.
What do other people think?
I think there's a difference between what people felt in their own pockets and what they thought all of their neighbors were feeling, right? A lot of times when you ask people, they'll say their economic situation is good, but the economy is bad. And I don't want to call that misinformation. I don't think that's what we're talking about when we talk about lies spread through. And I agree that people have been focusing a lot on that. But I think there's this wider question of the narratives that are being driven in our fractured media environment through podcasts, through folks like Rogan, where it's not fully misinformation, but it's not fully true. And because you can have some facts, you can talk about the fact that that carton of eggs is now $4 instead of $2.50. But then you can also weave in some things that are not entirely true about how the economy is doing. And because someone can fact check on, yeah, the eggs are more expensive, they now buy into that false narrative and that broader worldview that the economy is really bad and we need a businessman to fix it, even if I'm actually doing okay.
I just want to add one other thing to that. It was also the false narrative that the Biden put out with the Inflation Reduction Act. Talk about a really dumb name for something. And the reason is, if inflation comes down, it doesn't mean prices come down. And that's what people expected. When you hear the Inflation Reduction Act, that means, yeah, prices are going to come back down. No, they're not. They're going to stay, but your dollar's going to be able, the amount you're taking in and what your dollar can buy is going to match it. And I think that is where there was a narrative that people felt like they weren't getting what they should. You're telling me inflation's down, but I still am having a hard time at the grocery store. And I think that was a huge mistake of the Biden administration.
And to tie it into something that Jeff's been talking about, I've said, as both Susan and Alyssa have said, there's something about this moment that Americans don't feel that they can achieve their aspirations economically, whether it's buying a house, moving out of their home, especially younger voters. And I've been talking earlier today about, what younger voters, I was at Morehouse on Tuesday talking on a panel about similar issues. And, you have a lot of college students in that Atlanta University Center campus really concerned about whether they can get a job after graduation, student loans and things of that nature. So they have a difficulty sort of engaging their aspirations. So that's a big part. But, America's original sin is slavery, but the biggest hoax that America has played on its people is making them believe that there's not enough to go around, right? And that creates a class war, a race war. When you add layers of immigration to that, right? It's if you get something, that means you have to take it from me. And when you layer in the sort of cultural issues that the Democrats may not have been messaging properly, if you think about, and I'll just say this very quickly, after George Floyd, when there was a big progressive movement to defund police, even Congress member Jim Clyburn said, why the hell are we saying defund police? Because if you go to communities of color, particularly in New York, they would tell you, we don't want to defund the police. We want to call the police if there's something going on in our neighborhood. And I always say, we want to be the first people they call, not the last people we see, right? We don't want me to be killed. But look, if there's something going on in a neighborhood, we want the police to do their job and protect us. So I think one of the things that's happened is that there's been a lot that's been said, and there's been a lot of policy that's been pushed out that I don't think the party had a good way to sort of rein in and talk about to voters in ways that would be meaningful to them before Republicans could sort of take it and run with it and be able to say, look at what they're doing. This means you can't have X, or this means that if Black lives matter, why don't blue lives matter? Why don't all lives matter? And the inability for the party to sort of take that on head on and own it before it was taken, I think became a huge challenge for being able to sort of promote a good and strong narrative.
That's one of the things you mentioned briefly there, though, I actually think is a classic example of where the Democrats and cultural elitism get it wrong, which is we were talking about student debt, elimination of student debt. And first of all, what I heard from Black and brown voters was about housing costs. Yeah. And we're talking about erasing student debt. Many of these folks aren't even thinking about going to college. And so why? And then we're creating anger with a whole bunch of other folks in this country who've gone through and paid their own debt. Right. And so we're off. The party is off on that. And having a conversation about that made no sense. I mean, look, I think that the economic wins here were still headwinds, were still so fierce for the Harris campaign to deal with. And when we look at this race, big picture, one of the things that I've sort of concluded is there was probably no way for us to win. And I worked on the Harris campaign, so there was no way for us to win. Okay, well, we just spent $1 billion, so why the hell do it, right? Well, look, the Dallas Cowboys show up every single Sunday, right? I'm an Eagles fan. I despise the Cowboys, right? So the Cowboys show up every Sunday. I could say the Giants the same thing, and they lose almost every week because they stink, right? But yet, one out of every couple of games, you still win. Yeah, so you got to try.
You worked on some of the Senate races where the Democrats
but they actually didn't. So I want to be careful about that. They actually didn't. What they did is the Republican candidates underperformed Trump more so than the Democratic candidates overperformed. So I don't think it's that. I think that the economy was and the reason I'm focusing on this is going back to the economy and the $2 versus $4 price of eggs is Trump amnesia was the dominant thing to me in this election. When I look at why Kamala Harris was unable to win, it's because on election day, a majority of the voters believe that Donald Trump did a good job as president. A majority of the voters think that he did a good job as president. And by the way, if you've got one president who's at a 38% job approval as Joe Biden, and one president who you say, oh, that guy did a good job, well, who would you vote for? Putting all partisanship aside. And then they said, well, the cost of eggs was $2 under Donald Trump because, again, Trump amnesia was there. And so I think it was very real for folks. I think they did see it and understood. And that the flaw there really is that, therefore, Biden was a flawed messenger for a long period of time where the voters were unwilling to sort of, they weren't listening to him because they had already sort of moved past him or moved beyond it. And in that battle of the two candidates, Trump and Biden at the time, in the sort of choice of two evils, for whatever reason, Biden was worse, even though the economy was doing well. And so I think that is the piece of the economic narrative of sort of Trump did a good job and therefore the price of eggs. That's the thing that was dominant. And I do truly believe the cost of mortgages is a real thing that was devastating. Because again, when you think about how do I get ahead, how do I do stuff, just a whole different game than when we had a 3%, when I had a 3% mortgage under Donald Trump, and now we're at 7 plus 8%.
So this idea, I would like to talk more about this idea of performance of the down ballot candidates versus Trump. So there are a number of factors at play here. We talked about the job approval ratings. I mean, both candidates had fairly high unfavorable numbers. Certainly Biden's unfavorables were higher than what we usually seen for. I mean, I forgot to go back and compare them with Trump's toward the end of his administration when he was running for election in 2020. But do you think voters were able to do a good job of kind of distinguishing between who is at the top of the ticket and who is running in their Senate races, if they have them in the state, or for the House of Representatives? Because we do see, I mean, basically it looks like Republicans are going to end up with unified government, right? But it's interesting the way that certain races played out in terms of who overperformed or underperformed relative to Trump.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a mixed bag. So as Susan was just talking, and I said I want to be careful about it. So in Arizona, we know that Donald Trump's going to win by 3-4 points, and Ruben Gallego is going to win by 2 points. But what we also know is that Ruben Gallego got like 120% of Kamala Harris's vote, and Carrie Lake got 90% of Donald Trump's vote. So that suggests split ticketing. But then when you go to a place like Michigan, where the Republicans had a good candidate in Mike Rogers, not one of the lunatics from 2022, good candidate. He will have gotten 90% of what Trump got, and Alyssa Slotkin got 100% of what Kamala did. And so that underperformance is going to be real. In Nevada, the race that I did Jackie Rosen's race for Nevada Senate. She got what Kamala got, and Sam Brown underperformed Trump. So I think what you're going to see is a bunch of people who said, I'm going to vote for Trump, but I'm not willing to vote for the Republican. And there, by the way, I think abortion may very well have been one of the reasons, and why I believe abortion was still incredibly significant. And if we go down ballot to Pat Ryan's district in New York, right up the river from here, Pat Ryan, Kamala won by, I think, 4 points or something like that. By the way, Biden won the district by 9, Kamala won by 4, Pat Ryan won by 13. A tremendous amount of the stuff that he talked about was abortion, both in his last race and this one. So again, I think there's going to be a mixed bag of split ticketing, which I believe is fundamentally good for America. I love it because it means we get more candidates in the middle. I'm fine with that. So there's going to be some, but a whole bunch of folks that I think said, I'm willing to vote for Trump, but I'm not willing to vote for those folks.
Do you think also like the idea of being anti-establishment, mostly for like the Trump voters, but even Democrats like who maybe didn't show up or weren't so for Harris, like people want something different. So when they hear certain messages like from Ryan and other candidates that seem a little less partisan and more about their district, that it changes their numbers?
I think that's part of it, but again, I think when I think about sort of the overperformance, there's a narrative out there right now, for example, that turnout was down in the big cities for Kamala Harris. That's actually not true in the battleground states. What is true is the turnout was down in New York City and Chicago and et cetera. But these are in the non-battlegrounds, turnout was down. So in the places where we were competing from the campaign, we did fine. I think the impact is sort of in the over impact. Here, my favorite stat from this election, Donald Trump did 23 points better in AOC's district, right? That's my favorite stat, 23 points better in AOC's district. That's right. That's a wow. And so I don't think that's about sort of the Donald Trump being the sort of counter, like I'm against the establishment. That's frustration in all levels, economically, personally, whatever. And the double-digit moves towards Trump in New Jersey, California, New York, that's saying something bigger.
And can I just add to that very quickly? Because I was about to say that AOC comment about how the voters voted for her and Donald Trump, and like, how does that happen? And sometimes voters just want to vote for somebody that they feel is going to fight for them. And that's a form of sort of political disruption. Yeah. But there's a Latino voter that I heard about in Jersey. And just think about what she said. She said she voted for Donald Trump because if and this is a person who's an immigrant, so she had concerns, and I'm not sure exactly what her status was, but she had concerns. She did not vote. She wanted to vote for Kamala Harris, but she chose not to because she said if Kamala won, I'd be fine. But if Kamala won and I voted for her, if Donald Trump won and I voted for Kamala, they'd know and I'd be in trouble. So I should vote for Donald Trump. I mean, but just think about that, right?
I believe that.
That's, I mean, that's an extraordinary, like, personal strategic decision as to how to move their vote. And you've got to imagine how many times that's happening, throughout the country.
But it also shows the distrust in the institution, which is a whole nother issue.
Or fear of it. Right?
Or
Because
fear.
it's the fear that, and maybe it's because she comes from a country where this actually does happen, where the person who wins goes back and checks who cast their ballot for me. It's a real threat.
So this idea of split ticking, so political scientists have spent a lot of time trying to figure out split ticket voting, and it kind of that there's a literature huge in like the 80s and 90s, and it kind of died off, right? So
did split ticket voting. So
yeah,
that's why.
And so now it seems like it's coming back, and it seems like voters, rather than just sort of like this wholesale rejection of the incumbent party because of economic performance or perceived poor economic performance, voters were making more, I would say, sort of strategic decisions or more intelligent decisions about like, well, I'm going to vote against the Democrats because, Biden is responsible for this, even though, it's arguably whether he is or not, right? But then the down ballot, I'm going to vote for the person who is like more in line with me on the issues, understands my problems, or is just going to be somebody who is going to balance out Trump. I think that's what a lot of political scientists would say, is exactly this point about like, well, I'm going to vote for Trump because, I think he's the, even if I don't agree with him, I want to reject what Bidenomics is about. But I need somebody to balance out against what I worried that Trump might do, so I'm going to go for the Democrat down ballot. Is any sense of like that's what's going on?
So like Senate statewide races, I think it's a little different than like congressional races, because in Congress they may say, oh, I called their office and they fixed the pothole. Like, and that person tells 4 other people and says, oh, look, we got that done. I mean, it depends how, when congressional races can be just all on the ground in a lot different way, and they can just operate with not as much of a national spotlight on them, although it's harder and harder to do. But I think on the statewide level, like Senate, it is a little bit of a different ballgame. But yeah, I think voters are much smarter than we give them credit for, and that they think about their vote. How else do you explain Arizona, Trump, abortion, and going Democrat on the Senate? They thought people made a decision there, and they thought about it.
We definitely saw a lot of split ticketing in our polling, and we wanted to make sure that we were understanding it well, and we added a lot of qualitative data. We were collecting open ends in our polling to make sure we were understanding it correctly, and we actually saw a lot of very clear reasoning where people were saying, I like Trump on the economy, but I want to balance him out. Same with the abortion referendum. Obviously, there were also some states where there were kind of crazier candidates, like, say, for example, what happened in North Carolina, where Democrats almost sweep the Council of State, but then, right, are happy. The electorate says, okay, well, I've done my duty in the state. I'm going to vote for Trump nationally. So we saw a lot of that very conscientious split ticketing. I do think there are also other stories, right? I mean, quite frankly, in Arizona, in a lot of our open ends, I think the fact that Ruben Gallego was a man running against a woman may have helped and played, and there may have been other factors at play there. He's a fantastic candidate, but I do think that there were idiosyncratic issues in different races where some candidates were maybe more comfortable voting based on various identities.
So what would we say in light of this about the state of polarization, partisan polarization at more of the voter level, right? In the sense that there's been a lot of discussion how politicians have been polarized down party lines for a long time. Voters only have relatively recently followed them, so that you have, in terms of issues, people lining up more in terms of like, well, I'm definitely a Republican because all the issues align for me on taxes, on reproductive rights, social issues, et cetera. Same thing on the Democratic side. So should we basically pump the brakes on this idea that the electorate is polarizing to the same extent that elites have polarized, and that the voters are sort of thinking more about their decisions when they get in the polls about how to balance things out and not go completely for the Republicans or for the Democrats?
Well, I think they told us that at least in their voter registration, because the biggest group in voters is independents, not Republicans or Democrats. So I think you see that there's that nature. Now, yes, out of that group, probably 90% of them are divided into the camps that they probably came from, but they choose to identify. And that's that self-identification is something that I find interesting, as far as they're saying, I don't want to belong to that party or this party because I'm not all in on it. Or there may be the extreme of either one, turn them off.
Yeah, Greg, I would love it if split ticket voting was like massive. I do want to caution, these are minor. These are still very, very small. And so the polarization is alive, well, and thriving in the voters. We also need to remember that so much of what's happening at a congressional level is gerrymandered to a level that is insane in almost every state. And so the only way that we might be able to get back to a level of where polarization is not as crazy as if we had competitive congressional seats, competitive legislative seats, nonpartisan primaries, probably in all probability. Like, these are the things that would help us. But the institutions have created things, from partisan primaries to gerrymandering, that just have pushed us further and further to the extremes. And that's why our politics are depressingly where they are today.
Can I just make a point about the institutions? Because I try to center students, my students or any that I come into contact with, when I address this issue of institutions. When I was my first presidential vote was for Bill Clinton in '92, and I was still in college and undergrad, and I marched against apartheid. I may have taken over a building or two in those days. And Bill Clinton gets elected. He goes on the Arsenio Hall show, and for young voters, you're not going to know the significance of that, but look it up. He goes on his Arsenio Hall show. Huh?
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube. I'm sure it is. All grainy because it's old. But he goes on Arsenio Hall, and it's this interesting cultural moment, particularly as a person of color. And after he gets elected, you have Mignon Moore, who's African-American woman, is the White House political director. Alexis Herman, Rodney Slater is African-American cabinet members. Ron Brown becomes the first African-American head of the DNC. And there was a sense that even if the institutions were flawed, if you had the right people running them, things will be okay. But the majority of the young voters that I talk to everywhere just don't believe in the institutions at all. Just want them gone or blown up in some way and recrafted. And so in many ways, that's a kind of fundamental difference between, as a Gen Xer growing up, believing that the party or a party was a vehicle for political economic empowerment. And I wonder if that's still the case with a lot of younger voters in terms of this point about institutions and how they view institutions. So I even wonder how that plays into this notion of polarization, because it's not just two sides, right? It's that there is this really strong belief that none of these institutions are working. And maybe that does open the door for Donald Trump, but it also opened the door for Bernie Sanders, right? To be able to push that button.
Matt Gaetz will be there to defend all those institutions, so we'll be in good shape, Basil.
At some point, I do want to turn the conversation to what we can expect next, but there's still some other territory I'd like to cover before we get to that point. But Alyssa, did you want to chime in?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask this idea of like sort of anti-establishment, right? And so is this sort of showing up? Are we seeing this in poll numbers? I mean, we're seeing like, and what do we make of it in the sense of, periodically there's, rejection of the establishment, right? Vietnam, right? Nixon, Reagan, right? At certain points, or, sort of rejection of Carter and liberals in the 70s, and then Reagan is predominant. And then there's turning against Reagan, and then you talked about Clinton, and right. So we go through these cycles, right? In the sense of, so where do we think we are in terms of a cycle with regard to anti-establishment sentiment?
Be careful with that term, just real quick, before everyone answers, because I don't know if it's anti-establishment. I've used that term several times tonight, but also anti-institution. Like, what is the establishment? Like you say, like, who are the Democrats? Like, what is the establishment? To a lot of people, it's government. So, I mean, you
So
can
this
continue.
question-
So that's the question. I mean,
Yeah,
think
so
that's
I just want to know, like, if do we have an understanding of like where this of sort of what when they say we want to tear things down or we want to blow things up, we want something different, like, is it so a part of this would be the political parties, right? Some of it may be the democratic system of government that we have. Some of it might be the way that gerrymandering, you brought that up, the way sort of things are happening like that. I mean, is there any coherence to what we're saying here in terms of the rejection of institutions, and how was that reflected in this election?
It's a complicated question. I think that the reality is that the trust in institutions is at the lowest, and institutions go from academia to government to business to whatever it is, everything, right? Our numbers on the Supreme Court are abysmal, for example, and part of that, and all these things are intertwined with each other and partisanship. I don't know that, again, yes, Donald Trump seems to have won a bare majority of the vote. That does mean that 49.99% of the people voted against him. And I also don't know that even with Donald Trump's 50.1% of the vote, that all 50.1 of that is as anti-establishment as we would want to make it out to be. I still think this country is fundamentally one that is in the middle, where 70% of the population can agree on so many things. And somehow, some way, we're going to have to get back to that. I don't know how to do that. The notion of a third party or destroying the parties is a pipe dream and not going to happen. So I think the parties are going to have to figure themselves out. The Tea Party was going to revolutionize the Republicans, and that went away. And then the MAGA came in, and that'll go away. And the Squad came in, and that went away. All these are cyclical, as you said.
I think on the anti-establishment front, we also have to think about this in the international context. Every incumbent party has lost, right? Whatever happened from the pandemic, from the lockdowns, from the ignoring lockdowns, from inflation and recessions and unemployment, every single incumbent party has lost. The Financial Times had a wonderful graphic of this looking over time. And sometimes that has meant a switch to the left, like in the UK, where Labour had this historic victory. For us, that means a shift back to the right. But it was the smallest shift of any party, right? So in some ways, it goes back to those kind of headwinds that she was just fighting against so much, and it was too much to fight against. But given what we know, she probably did a really wonderful job in fighting it.
Don't you kind of think that in any given time it could have broke either? I think it was going to break. I thought it was just going to break towards her on Wednesday. Like, I thought we were going to have an answer on Wednesday that it would break enough. And I think on 5 out of 10 days.
Well, Nate Silver said that. He said he ran the model 80,000 times, 40,000 times she won, 40,000 times he won. And more importantly, 40,000 times the blue wall went to him, and 40,000 times the blue wall went to her. So that's what you're looking at a 50-50. That's exactly right.
And I think that's what we're going to see also. Like, when you say what comes next, he is going to have 2 years of unified government. But there's going to be a very thin majority in the House that is going to have to be kept together, as he's particularly rating the House for a lot of appointments. I think we're going to see midterms that are similar to 2018. I think people didn't want unified government under the Republican control, and I think he's going to act like he has much more of a majority and much more of a mandate than he actually has. I'm not saying a lot of awful things won't happen and that a lot of people won't get hurt, but I do think there will be a course correction in 2026.
We see this, I mean,
It's easy.
historic, right? It's a question of like, how big will it be?
It's really tough for because the math for the Democrats in the Senate is really, really tough in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
I immediately looked at that. I was like, oh boy, this is rough. But there is, we talk about Susan Murkowski and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins but there's another person who could probably whip a vote or two and will do it with glee if he can, is Mitch McConnell. don't underestimate his, even if it's against breaking up the filibuster, something like that, more traditional, or being against recess appointments, things like that. I think he may be able to hold a little, he'll be like that vote that maybe won't allow us to go completely into the abyss, just kind of get really, really, really close to the edge.
I'm not sure I want to live in a world where I have to have faith in Mitch
I
McConnell.
have to find a way of things working for the next 2 years, and these are the things that.
But the biggest institution that's clearly with egg on its face is the mainstream media. Talk about an institution that covered the Madison Square Garden endlessly, and look at what that did. So there's definitely, and Joe Rogan can get 60 million people to listen to 3 hours of horseshit, and yet we're talking about Fox News and CNN and MSNBC all together getting 5 million people to watch it. It's like it is a different landscape in terms of how we're getting our information as well, that I think people need to adapt to. So
this fractured media market is something I wanted to talk about and put in the questions that I shared with you. But this idea that it's just a completely different media environment from what it was 8 years ago even, and so. What do we make of it? I mean, how do we just sort of need to, are there analogies to other periods where oh, now we have radio or now we have television, but this idea, cable news was a big thing. Now you can watch, 200 different channels. Now we have, so much more in terms of the podcasts you can listen to, the YouTube videos you can watch. And how do we, or the different apps you can have on your phone to follow things. So how do we make sense of that, the impact of that on what happened on Tuesday? And if you could tie this at all back to this notion of how things broke, I think, people in the know did expect things to break one way or the other. A lot of people didn't expect it to break for Trump, but it did. And so was there something about this fractured media market, about Joe Rogan? I mean, there was a very late endorsement from Joe Rogan. Is it something along those? Could we discern that? Or is there anything in the analytics that would help us understand this better?
I don't think we're going to find that. I think that what is interesting to me, to use one example in a swing state. So in Pennsylvania, nationally, the Harris campaign made a bold decision to spend a majority of their paid advertising dollars in either digital or online, digital online, but also OTT, which is Hulu, YouTube, Roku, all those things. 65%, I think, ish of their dollars went to those methods of communication. And on the other side, you had a Senate race where Bob Casey's campaign spent 65% of their dollars on traditional, what we call linear or broadcast TV. And they got the same thing. So I'm struggling with what does that mean? There is no doubt that much more money, it was a big thing when Barack Obama spent 15 or 20% of the campaign's budget online. We've already moved to places where clearly it needs to be much, much higher in the fractured media environment. And I think what Kamala did, Trump did Rogan, Kamala did Call Your Daddy. These are both incredibly influential places with millions and millions of listeners. And I think campaigns are just going to have to be smarter about finding those unique places where people are. And not just assuming we can blast something out on put it on 60 Minutes and people are going to see it.
Which goes to polarization, because people are going to seek media that they want, especially subscription. Yeah. I mean, Substack, where are you going to get your news from? CNN, whatever it is, everything is, when you're paying for it, there is something that you are deeply invested in, and you're not going to necessarily hear other ideas, and I know we go through this. Was it you who said radio, and then we went to cable and everything, but this is a little different. This is choosing what you want, who you want to hear from, and validating your thoughts, not expanding them. So I agree on the campaign side. I agree with you 1,000%, but that means exactly who you're talking to, and those podcast listeners aren't necessarily listening or finding the same news or even getting the same facts.
And one thing that I think we also need to talk about as we're talking about this fractured media environment is the gender gap that we're seeing. Obviously, the gender gap comes in many different elections, but the gender gap was very big. Obviously, the election poll data is very much, kind of a first run. It'll get reweighted when we have actual results. So we do need to give time, but we're seeing very large gender gaps. And one of the things that I think has been harder this cycle is that we're also seeing those gender gaps with young men, right? Democrats are losing ground with young men. I don't think it's as bad as all of the media says. We've done some polling on this, but it's definitely not where young voters are expected to be or taken to granted to be. And part of it is this fractured media environment that young men and young women are getting their news from and listening to completely different things. And this is going to cause all sorts of challenges in society, both culturally and politically. But I think it's something that Democrats need to take very seriously as they look towards the next 4 years, is not just traditional campaign tactics, but thinking about this media environment and what media they should be investing in as they build forward.
Well, we spent a whole couple of weeks talking about whether or not black men were going to vote for Kamala Harris, right? Ridiculous. There was some slippage, no question about it. But seriously, should we have been spending all of that time having that conversation? And to Susan's point, it's not just what you're choosing. It's the fact that when you make those choices, then the apps start pushing to you. I always love to give this example. I went to Cornell undergrad, and sometimes they asked me to come back and speak, and I was there around 2018. And, I had about 4 or 5 hours to kill. So what do you do when you have 4 hours to kill in Ithaca, New York? You get a tattoo. So I was getting this tattoo. And, it's captive audience, right? I'm not going anywhere. The artist's not going anywhere. We just can't move, right? So I rarely ever talk about just sort of openly what I'm doing there and why, because I think I was actually working for the state party at the time. But I always ask, how do you get your news? And he said, YouTube. This is 2018. And I asked him, I said, really, you get your news from YouTube? He said, yeah. Then he told me who he follows. And he said, I like him because of X. I like him, all men, by the way. I like him because of this. I like him because of that. I said, do you ever look at anything? Well, no, I like those guys. So, that's not really news. Yeah, but I like what they have to say. And that's all you need to know, right? And when I think about, and just again try to say to my students, and with for full disclosure, both Susan and I are both paid contributors for MSNBC. None of my students watch me at all. They'll say, my parents love you, but they do not watch me at all, because where do you get your news from? TikTok. Right. That's right. TikTok, Twitter, to whatever extent, right? So the question is, how do we get in the middle of that to get you information? That's expensive and it's time consuming, and and then you've got to discern for yourself, is what you're watching actually real?
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
On this question of expense, so I spent the weekend before the election in Pennsylvania, and I was watching TV, and it was just ad after ad after ad, and I'd never seen any of these ads. Living in New Jersey and we're living in New York, you don't see any of this stuff, right? And so we know we spent billions of dollars. I think Harris spent $1 billion in Pennsylvania on this alone. So are we going to move away from this? Like our campaign, or is it just going to be, well, we have to spend the money because we don't want to unilaterally disarm. And this is something we've just been doing for ages and ages. So we have to keep doing it, even though maybe what we need to be focused on is more on the TikTokers and the influencers in their podcasts and those kinds of things.
Kamala Harris spent a lot of time talking to influencers and trying. So I'm not sure that was the solution. And TikTok, unfortunately, doesn't take advertisements. So there's no way to deal with TikTok other than organic creators. I do think the notion of sort of dominating the 6 o'clock news the way traditional campaigns do, meaning I'm from Philly, so I saw plenty of ads in Philadelphia, and it's obnoxious. If you live in a swing state, it is obnoxious. Try to watch the news, and it's just impossible. But even worse, try to watch the Phillies game as I did. And it's just as bad. And this year it was just as bad on the Phillies games because young men were the target. And so I still think, Greg, that we on the campaign level, we're smart about spending our money where people who we know we need to talk to are. And so if those eyeballs aren't on those TV programs that you're talking about, we're not going to be there at some point in time. Our money is going to, there's always going to be money in politics. There has been since George Washington bought his first election, right? There's plenty of money in politics. Yeah, he got the guys drunk to get him elected. So we are smart. Do we get it right all the time? No, but because there's so much data that tells us what are people looking, consuming, et cetera, we're going to try to find ways to make sure that we are as micro-targeted as possible. Somebody told it to me, somebody asked me this question yesterday in one of my first post-elections that I was doing. She said, well, the Kamala Harris campaign was spending a lot of money because I got an ad talking about your vote is your private choice. As a woman talking to me, your vote is your private choice, right? Well, Kamala Harris campaign did not spend a lot of money talking about that. That is a micro-targeted ad to that woman who is very clearly married, a Democratic woman who's clearly married to an independent or Republican man. And that's why she got that ad. You know, that's creepy, but it's also cool, right?
Cool. That's the Julia Roberts ad?
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but it could have been.
At the end of the day, it's also one other thing. Technology is moving so fast that we as campaign operatives, it's harder to learn. Like once you learn from 2020, 2024 is a whole different beast. And 2026 is good. 2024 was different. 2026 is probably going to even move faster. So a lot of us are playing catch up just to being able to figure out how to target, whereas when you use traditional radio, TV, cable, blah, print, that was pretty easy. And as it started to change a little bit, it wasn't too hard. This time, it's really fast.
By the way, I'll shut up on one thing. The Trump campaign spent millions of dollars on direct mail. Direct mail. That, by the way, I think was devastatingly effective. So we're talking about a lot of new stuff and newfangled shit, like direct mail to voters on stuff. The menthol cigarettes that Basil's talking about was direct mail to black voters talking about the Democrats want to take away your menthol cigarettes because they're woke son of a bitches, right? That's amazing. And direct mail, millions and millions of dollars.
Can I do
Back to the Future.
I have a YouTube story associated with that. I'm not going to tell you how I got down this rabbit hole, but I will get down a rabbit hole on it.
Tattoo?
No, but a similarly weird story. I started getting a lot of, and I'm just going to, it's going to sound weird, trust me, but I will just say there's no real reason that I was getting this because I'm not married and have children. I don't have children, but I was getting a lot of, if you know the show, paternity court clips in my feed. This African-American woman as a judge and a lot of Black couples fighting for paternity. That was getting in my feed a lot, and I'm not sure exactly why. But I decided, let me click on this and see what's going on. So I wound up clicking on it, went to YouTube, and as the show clip is being played, who's at the first commercial break? Donald Trump. And I was like, look at that. Look at that. So to your point, they will go find you, right? They will go find you where you are.
Well, I think on that note, we will just say thanks to our panel, and everybody now have an opportunity to applaud them. This is incredibly insightful, exceeded my expectations, certainly. Thank you all. Hopefully you'll stay in touch with us, and we'll have more conversations like this and provide insights when people are struggling to understand what happened. Thank you again.